So Yushin's just turned on the recording. Thank you for that, Yushin. And this will carry on the recording until the end of my talk, and then the discussion will not be recorded. So here's the topic, and I hope you can see the black screen now with the writing Prospects of AI in Education and my name underneath it. And I'm just clicking through to the next slide. So what is this about? What am I going to talk about today? I feel I need to give something of a disclaimer, something of a warning to people in case they're expecting something different from what I can offer. So this is not the discussion of the latest developments in AI technology, nor an assessment of specific projections for development in the development in the technology. I shouldn't say library. It's a critical reflection on technology and policy context, on the technology and policy context in which such developments are taking place. Now, it's commonly understood now that technology is not just a purely technical thing. A technology always develops in relation to a social context and certain expectations and perceived needs into which the technology fits. To take a very simple example here, the computer that you have in front of you, the keyboard that you have there, computers didn't need to develop in this way. There's all manner of other formulations that could have been developed for the way the interface would work between the computer and the human being. They didn't need to be developed in relation to office technology. They could have been developed in relation to powering washing machines or something quite different in the early stages. So what we see in front of us right now, the keyboard, is partly a product of social need and social purpose. This is one reason why we need to take such matters into account when we're talking about artificial intelligence in education. So through my discussion, I'll raise questions about what can and cannot be done in the development of AI in education, and I'll be placing a particular emphasis on the nature of teaching and learning. I do recognize that the people who are propounding these ideas, who are developing ideas, sometimes get a bit carried away, I think, with their plans. But a lot of them are very sensible, and there's much measured assessment, careful assessment of what can and cannot be done. So let me quote Rose Luckin of the Knowledge Lab and her colleagues, who've put it in the following words in an essay called Empowering Educators to be AI Ready. And she writes very judiciously, they write judiciously, as has been recognized, we've been all too quick to recognize the power of massive data crunching deep learning without always recognizing its limitations with the same speed and vigor. By contrast, the opposite is true for our human intelligence. We can be quick to recognize its limitations and slow to recognize all its unique and powerful capabilities. So that's a very nicely balanced remark, the spirit of which I hope will be carried through in what I go on to say. I also very much approve this emphasis on AI readiness. That kind of phrase is used quite a lot in educational planning and policy. It does seem particularly apt in the present context in relation to AI, and I'll touch on this a little bit in what I'm going on to say now. So this context I want to pay attention to, I'm going to consider a context which stretches back to the 1950s and 60s and the work of the renowned psychologist, behaviorist B.F. Skinner. And he expressed great faith in the potential of teaching machines for revolutionizing education. There's a picture of a machine that he indeed worked with and helped to develop. And these machines, the ones he referred to, were to lead students through a step-by-step process where short passages of exposition and explanation were to be followed by a test activity. Success in the test led the student to the next step, while failure provided them with some further explanation of the same level and a further test. This process became known as programmed learning. In fact, when I was training to be a teacher some 50 years ago, they asked us to write a program that could be used in principle in a machine that took a particular learning task and took the students through this step-by-step process. And Skinner envisaged then the classroom of the future as being full of machines with individuals working at their own pace. They would work at their own pace with frequent reinforcement of correct behavior. If today I want to learn how to use spreadsheets, I can indeed find programs on the internet that will lead me through a similar step-by-step process. So there is a role for this, but note that the example I've given, learning spreadsheets, is a relatively confined thing. You need to know how to fill in the cells and how to modify the sides of the columns, how to create the formulae and so on. But I suppose that's most of what you need to learn. It doesn't kind of expand and go on in the way that other aspects of education do. It's more a matter of training to use a particular tool. If we move forward a little bit to the 1980s, in schools in this country and in many countries in the world, there was a great drive to introduce classes in computing to secondary education. There was a sense of urgency about the need to bring computers into schools, and courses in computer programming became widely available in secondary education, high school education, usually as alternatives to more familiar curriculum subjects. Let's leave out history. People don't really need that, do they? But they need to know how to program computers because that is a skill for the future. But this practice waned. It was stopped in many respects. It waned with the realization that what was needed as an essential skill for the future was not so much computer programming as competence with computer applications. So that touches on the idea of computer readiness, doesn't it? AI readiness that I referred to earlier on. And it's obvious to you and me that we're surrounded by computer applications, including the ones we're using right now. Meanwhile, computerization in schools was having a very significant effect, at least at the visible level of administration, the management of classes, the management of institutions, the management of systems of education. And this encompassed changes in forms of assessment and monitoring of students, in which the gathering of data in numerical form was increasingly required. So it seemed that the teachers had to carry out exercises that produced data that could feed the computers the managers were using. It seemed to be a virtuous practice, and it seemed to make the whole thing run more tidily, more smoothly. That was how it looked in theory, anyway, in principle. Now, what gets measured gets managed. And what is measured easily is easy to automate. That's a principle that guides so much thinking in this respect. If I move on to the 1990s, then there are, I think, some significant shifts of certain kinds there. And I'm going to introduce the idea of the new community college, as I will call it. And I want to give you a sketch of the way that community colleges, that's the North American terminology. In this country, we've called them technical colleges or further education colleges. And these would be places for students to go after they finish compulsory schooling, which could be 16 at that time, after they finish compulsory schooling, in order perhaps to be trained to be a hairdresser or a plumber, or to do some more academic work if they wanted to improve grades or wanted an alternative to school for their A-levels. And indeed a place for people to come back to later in life when they were made redundant, or if they wanted to upskill in some way or other. So colleges were large places with thousands of students, many of them doing part-time courses, sometimes on block release from employment, a lot of collaboration with employers. Now, during the 80s and 90s, the structure and style of these places was being rethought quite drastically. And a new way of working, instead of having a fixed timetable with set classes and a prescribed curriculum, a new way of learning and teaching and learning was being developed that was intended to be more flexible and, as the title up here suggests, open to all, regardless of their personal circumstances, for example, disability, or perhaps living too far from the college, or perhaps doing shift work so they couldn't attend a weekly timetabled class, other factors that might come into play. So the idea was that what the college had to offer would be customer oriented and would be available all the time. So here's a kind of advert for such a college. Open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the community college offers a range of unitized courses with learning programs tailored to meet individual needs. All programs carry full certification with multiple exit routes. Ensuring availability to all, learning opportunities can be accessed through learning centres, fully resourced with computing facilities, CD-ROM technology, and a wealth of study materials. Student services offer diagnostic tests to enable the accreditation of prior experience and learning and the negotiation of appropriate learning programs. The college mission statement and equal opportunities policy set out its commitment to meet the needs of employers and to serve all sections of the community. Now, I was working in one such college in the 1980s and early 90s, and this was indeed the ideal that they were aiming at, so that teachers were kind of airbrushed from the scene to some extent. Instead, you would have learning facilitators. Now, a colleague of mine was a very enthusiastic, lively teacher of sociology, and he was working in one such learning centre where students would drop in to do their own work, and he was working as a facilitator there. And he helped one student with an essay she was writing and was teaching her a bit more sociology in relation to this essay. Later on, a report went round. This is all pre-email, so a report on paper saying that a senior manager had caught him teaching in the learning centre. So teaching had become a kind of crime. And ideally then in this model, if you went to the college, you'd go first to this diagnostic centre, and it'd be more like going to a travel agent to discuss the kind of holiday that you might take up, to diagnose your interests, your needs. That was the model. So in post-compulsory education, which I'm talking about then, there was the new ideal of open learning. Courses would be available when and where students could access them, with each course customized to the student's individual needs, potentially on a global scale, because courses could be sold, as indeed they are now, to people who are not in the country. Such emancipatory ambitions were compromised, however, by a more managerialist impulse. Notice the differences here then. The emancipatory idea of enabling people to learn, to follow their own interests, to expand themselves as people, that's an emancipatory ideal, but it gets compromised by this managerialist impulse, where in fact the computers are helping the managers to keep things in order, to unitize learning, to commodify it, to sell it as credentials, as it were, that the student will gain. And part of this managerialist impulse was actually captured by a phrase that sounds very unmanagerialist, the phrase lifelong learning. John Dewey had talked about lifelong education, education from the cradle to the grave, so that education wasn't seen just as something that you did from the age of 5 to the age of 16 or 18 or whatever age one might specify, but something that was integral to human life and would carry on throughout it. In 1997, it was the European Year of Lifelong Learning when this idea was promoted very greatly, but it was promoted not in the form I've just associated with John Dewey. It was promoted very much as a matter of upskilling in preparation for the knowledge economy. Okay, in this context then, what often happens is that knowledge gets viewed as a commodity. It actually becomes partly estranged from the human being in the way that Karl Marx describes. It becomes something that you hold at a distance, that you move about and manipulate, rather in the way that a computer manipulates the data that it handles. What also emerged in the late 90s and 2000s was the vocabulary of customerization, so that the business of profiling customers that supermarkets engage in and giving them more of what they like was coming into the practices of this highly managed college environment. So what happened in effect was that there was a kind of hijacking of the emancipatory potential of some of these ideas and of many of the aspirations of those who worked in such colleges, who are very committed to empowering students, enabling them to have a second chance to lead richer lives. But that vocabulary was hijacked, the vocabulary of empowerment and emancipation, by a managerialist agenda, where empowerment became gaining skills for employment. Okay. Also, I want to look back just a little bit to, to my mind, a brighter note. In 1985, Donna Haraway wrote what she called her Manifesto for Cyborgs. This is an enormously influential paper, which she developed in much of her later work, and an intentionally provocative title. Now, the capacity of computers to handle information, which is very, very clear to us, had been anticipated back in the 1950s by Martin Heidegger, and he had, to my mind, convincingly criticized this capacity of handling information, the problems that might arise from this. And I'll try and say a little bit more about that later. But he was sounding a generally antipathetic note in relation to the technology as it was developing then. He talked about binary thinking as a danger to the world greater than the atom bomb, the hydrogen bomb, as we might say now, nuclear weapons, a danger greater than nuclear weapons. And of course, he's thinking of the way computers operate and deal with or construct data. But on the more positive note then I want to strike here, Donna Haraway drew attention to different prospects in the development of computing, specifically those related to extensions of communication. And she did this with what amounts to a conceit. That means a surprising comparison, nothing to do with being big-headed or something, a surprising comparison. She exploited the idea of the cyborg, borrowing from science fiction films and the like, the cyborg being half human, half machine. And she associates this way of thinking that she tries to describe, cybernetic thinking, she associates this with a more feminized understanding of the technology, as opposed to the dominant command control image imparted by its most obvious capacities and use at that time. So her work acknowledges the partiality in human ways of thinking and being, that they don't get the whole, they see things from a particular point of view. They can only operate in partial ways. And in acknowledging that, she's acknowledging it, not lamenting it, but seeing it as part of the richness of human experience, which the command control type of thinking tends to cover over. She also sees it as helpfully blurring some of the dominant dualisms of mind, body, self, other, human being, object as well, that bedevil much of our thinking in her view. And I'll come back to those dualisms later on. She also anticipated the development of the internet. And she, of course, it's true that the internet dramatically expanded the potential importance of the new technology's influence in education, especially in terms of communication and the availability of information. There's no doubt that we benefit enormously from the fact that we can Google so easily and so much. The internet's also answered most powerfully to the principled aim of extending education to those who'd previously been in some degree excluded. And it is true that now the opportunities you can access from home to learn new things and to enter into more quite complex courses in many respects are unprecedented. Okay, so that is part of the technological background. I want to now pay a bit of attention to the nature of the policy and the rhetoric, the discourse that surrounds these developments, because that feeds into the construction of the social context and the expectations in which the technology is formed. So analysis of the emergence of artificial intelligence in education needs to take this background into account, as well as its policy rhetorical context. Now, here's a sample from a recent book by Holmes, Bialik, and Fadel. They write, AI's emergence in education must reinvigorate the deeper learning goals of a modern education. Versatility, for robustness to face life and work, relevance, for applicability and student motivation, transfer, for broad future actionability. Now, just linger on that quotation for a moment, and you see the three keywords there: versatility, relevance, transfer. And perhaps you recall the extent to which abstract nouns like this assume great prominence in education. They become key words for taking policy forward. Words that managers will repeat and teachers will know they must refer to. Resilience would now be one such word. They also are often very elastic words, words which can mean a vast range of different things and to some extent can mean what you want them to mean. Now, I don't suggest that the authors are guilty of all those weaknesses, but I'm trying to draw attention to the problems with the discourse itself. So, in my view, the phrasing here resonates with an increasingly familiar educational newspeak. Newspeak's a word that George Orwell coined in 1984 to talk about the imposition or the growing prevalence of a particular vocabulary which channels the way that people think. So this newspeak then that I'm referring to comes with a rather stark separation of content and method, teaching content and method, where much of the focus is on the latter, on method, especially on learning and teaching or delivery, as it is now so often put. And delivery, of course, plays into the idea that we've got a production process, like a car production line with various resources going in at the beginning, various changes to those materials, and then an output at the end where we know what we want to get. And indeed, the Toyota production line in the early 50s developed a principle of TQM, total quality management, which has been emulated in so many other aspects of our world of production and our social world. It's very good for producing reliable, good quality cars. Whether it's appropriate in other aspects of our social experience is another point. So the rhetoric's been a feature of the developments described above, with technology positioned at the forefront of school effectiveness and improvement. And there are some more buzzwords which were really dominant in the 1990s in particular: school effectiveness and improvement. Effectiveness and improvement are very good, but actually they don't mean much unless you know what you want to do. So they have the effect of ducking those questions of content and substance, which I would take to be fundamental. Now, let me try to separate some of what I see here as the hype of the new technology and the rhetoric that this plays along with from what I think is the achievement, what's actually happened. What AI can do in education now is familiar enough: gathering data, diagnosing the learning stage someone's at and their needs and desires, searching and finding, recommending. And of course, there is endless scope for blended learning. That's to say, combining elements of what I've just described, working with the machine, with the interaction with people in classes, either directly or like the present context in Zoom rooms and so on. And so I think there genuinely is great potential, and we're profiting from some of that in what we're doing right now. Given the hardware and infrastructure, there are possibilities of immense economies of scale, and in principle, the distribution of high-quality learning resources worldwide. Harvard lectures available throughout the world, ideally free of charge or at low cost. That's not impossible to realize if there was the political will to do so. And I don't just mean Harvard lectures, of course. I'm thinking of a much wider range of ways in which knowledge might be imparted and shared. But the tendency is that these practices bring with them a streamlining of processes. And I want to accent both words there: streamlining and processes. Again, rather like the smooth production line, where nothing is allowed to go wrong at any stage. The very conception of things as a process. First step, second step, third step. Sometimes it's appropriate to think like that. And actually learning spreadsheets, it's a pretty good way to plan that teaching and learning. But not all teaching and learning takes that form. Now, if in the past and in principle, it has seemed reasonable to approach the organization of a course on a particular topic by determining what's to be studied, we're going to do a course in history, providing appropriate teaching, we need teachers who are knowledgeable about history and this aspect of it, and then assessing what the students have learned, we need to work out some way of providing a test appropriate to the teaching and learning they've experienced. Can you see the direction of travel there? That's now partly been reversed because there's so much concern about processes of assessment and the supposed rigor of those processes of assessment, and those processes producing data that fits into the demands that the computer systems make upon us, that we now reverse the process. We begin with what the assessment's going to be like. Then we choose content that can fit this assessment. There's no point in teaching anything unless it's going to be able to be assessed in an exam. And then we choose methods of teaching and learning that actually teach to the test. The problem is, I think, familiar enough, and I hope I illustrated here part of the way it's developed. Now, in this process, I'm wary of the word, but in this process, the content of learning is apt to become reduced and understood as a deliverable. I've already referred to that word with scare quotes, haven't I? And learning is likely to be reduced to the acquisition of competencies and skills of knowledge, access, and communication. So we can turn ourselves something like computer RAM, and what the content in is just that ROM stuff that's out there, which we've got the skills to access. It's all there in the databases for us. So our personal engagement with that content is reduced. Our relation to it is reduced. It's dichotomized in the way that I was alluding to before, and that Donna Haraway was criticizing. So where in this is the relation to the teacher, and actually what happens to teaching, what happens to learning itself in this context? That's part of the worry. So where's the teacher? Let's try and go from there. And this is not a new idea that teaching and learning can be understood in relation to a triangle with those 3 points to it. And my sense of this is that the important thing is what happens here in the middle, that the teacher's-learner relationship, if it's good, and if it develops, is often through the content. It's typically and should be through the content. So that's crucial that that is there. Similarly, the learner's relation to the content may be rather deadened unless it's enlivened by some kind of live interaction, personal interaction with a person who can relate to this content and in whom that content is alive. Similarly, if you have a purely teacher-content relationship, then the danger is a very old style of teaching where the teacher's absorbed in their content and the students just have to passively absorb it, as it were. So the crucial thing is in the middle. So with the emphasis on efficient process, this triangle, I think, is weakened, the emphasis on the middle of the triangle. And then if that's weakened, those connections in there are weakened, then what often happens is there is a kind of compensatory move that puts some emphasis on the relation between the teacher and the learner, perhaps developing the teacher's skills in relation to handling students, or teaching students how to be appropriately ready for their class. And that, to my mind, is compensatory, but a distraction from the emphasis on content, which should be the thing that glues it all together. What's weakened is the sense of the relationship of the teacher through the content and of the content having its life in the relationship. So I'm alluding to something like Michael Oakeshott refers to in his famous phrase, slightly adapted, the conversation of humankind. A conversation not just like the one that we might have later on this evening when we're discussing things, but a conversation that goes on through the things you read, through the things you hear on TV, the stuff you read on the internet, and the stuff that stretches back to discussions that took place ages ago, to books that were written by people now long dead. That's a continuing conversation through which subjects and enthusiasm and involvement in learning develops. How is all this affected then, whether your teaching is provided by an artificial intelligence? I want to approach this via a consideration of one aspect of that relationship, and that emphasis is particularly related to the notion of trust. But initially, I'm going to do this via an indirect route, an example that's not directly related to an educational context. And I want to ask, how does the question of trust play out in the relationship with the AI teacher, which is what I'll go on to talk about in about 10 minutes' time, I expect, after I've taken you through this initial example. So how far, I want to say, does thinking about social robots cast light on this? So in doing this, I'm drawing on work by Paula Sweeney, quite recent work by Paula Sweeney, on the topic of trusting social robots. She's not talking about education, as you will see, but I think her argument is a valuable takeoff point for the line of thought that I want to lead you along. And she argues that trust is generally considered to be a deeply human attitude that cannot be bestowed upon objects. By contrast, reliance is appropriate to objects. So I trust the brakes on my car, I rely on them, and of course I'm assuming they've been thoroughly tested before when it was serviced or when the product was made in the first place. So a social robot is one that interacts in what is interpreted as a social way and appears to present actions as being the result of intentions. And her reference point is Paro. Paro is a robot which is in the form of a seal, a white seal, and this seal responds affectionately to its owner and gets to know the owner's movements, blinks its eyes, raises its head, moves closer, moves away, does all those things that you might expect from an affectionate, responsive pet. That's the idea. And it's used especially with elderly people, especially those who are infirm in some way or other, who cannot move about very much and who perhaps are lonely. The facade or deception inherent in our engagement with social robots, she says, both facilitates and is in danger of undermining trust. You get used to the robot, it moves to your hand when you touch it, it looks up at you, it blinks its eyes. All of those reinforce some sense of trust. But of course, at the same time, there is part of you that knows that the robot is just a robot, is not a real seal. Trust in social robots then must rely on an independent judgment of product reliability. And I think that she's deliberately now shifting vocabulary slightly and using the vocabulary of product, of production, of technology, and so on. So if you bought one of these robots, you want to check that it was properly tested, came from a reliable manufacturer, it had passed various tests and all the rest of it. You want to be sure you're in good hands before you ask your grandmother to use such a thing. So evidence suggests that as social robots come to play a larger role in our lives, in healthcare, for entertainment, and for personal support, we do increasingly develop relationships that are compatible with attitudes of trust towards them. And the boundaries that existed that made trust appropriate for humans, but not for objects, are becoming blurred or under significant pressure, she writes. To be eligible recipients of trust and not just reliability, robots must have the appearance of language use, freedom, and social relations. The very fact that the behavior that the trust is dependent on is deliberately fake, and perhaps for good reason designed to elicit false beliefs, potentially undermines the very trust that it enables. So you can see the tension she's getting at, that robots lead us into a kind of duplicitous behavior that in a sense is not quite honest, because we know it's just a machine, but we get to like it. We're pleased to see it when it looks up and, quotes, smiles at us when it responds to our touch. Social robots' displays of social behavior engendering trust are not evidence of their cooperative attitudes, but are entirely perfunctory, purely functional, related to that particular action, that moment. So are we trusting social robots on the basis of a faulty assumption that the social behavior social robots display is sufficient evidence of their cooperative attitude? So you see the dilemma, the worry she has here, and she comes to this partial solution. She says we can temporarily give in to the emotional attachment. We can also remind ourselves that the inner life of agency that we project onto the object is a fiction we've created. No one tried to trick us. We've been part of this creation. Hence, we can toggle between these two mindsets, between seeing a fictional sentient being and seeing a synthetic product, not sentient, synthetic product. And she adds a caution: the attitude of trust we take towards the social robot is underpinned by an implicit assumption regarding the reliability of the product. As I emphasized earlier, we must, however, remain alert to the possibility that the product could be or could become unreliable. It could be programmed with a purpose beyond or even at odds with our personal health. So I hope you see the way she's structured that argument about this kind of tension between our desire for emotional attachment and to see the seal as a real live thing, and at the same time our holding back from that, our remembering that it's just a machine and it's not really responding to us as a real animal or person might. Okay. I think it should make you think of other things that human beings find comforting, babies with blankets and that kind of thing, and the way those comforting things play a part in our lives more generally. And I'll come back to that in a second. Some questions then about Sweeney's notion of trust and how this argument is structured. In the course of it, she makes reference to Mario Rosario Tadeo's comment that trust is a facilitator of interactions among the members of a system. And on the face of it, that seems a reasonable statement, perhaps. But the 4 key words in the definition contribute to a picture of more or less isolated, though potentially cooperating human subjects, surrounded by a world of objects. And this reinforces certain points in the argument of Sweeney that we've just gone through. When I read through that argument, I emphasized objects quite a lot. And the words in this definition: trust, facilitator, interaction, members, system. I think they also belong to the way of thinking that I want to put into question now. So how does the category of objects fare when it comes to a cherished possession? I talked about the small child's blanket, but think for a moment of things that matter to you, that you like to carry with you, or that you are near you when you're in bed at night, or precious objects, things that matter often because of their personal history rather than their intrinsic value. Might be a favorite item of clothing or jewelry, for example. It might be your Arsenal shirt. It could be your car. People sometimes are very attached to their car. It could be a cross with all the symbolism and significance that carries, whether you're wearing it or kneeling before it in a church, say. Water. Now, of course, this moves into a different gear, as it were, because of the fundamental importance of water in human life and the multiple ways that it comes into human behavior and human activity, including the ways in which it comes into religious activities. I think across the range of religions, water has some significance. The coming of the rains. So what is the relation of the farmer to the seasons and whether the rains will come when they're needed? I know this may sound slightly archaic for most of us in the world, the non-agricultural world that most of us live in, but the relation to the rains, to depending on the weather, is still a very real thing for people around the world. What about the relation to a photo of a loved one? Wittgenstein talks about the photo of the loved one that one might kiss, and he takes that seriously. He doesn't say take it as the kind of crazy thing to do. It's only a piece of paper or an iPad. He takes that as very seriously as a significant part and a reasonable part of human behavior and of what constitutes having a loved one, and so on. A favorite text. Now, those books you've got perhaps which you really don't want to lose. You don't just want the electronic version, you want the one that you can hold. What about attachment to a character in a fiction, to James Bond or some other character whom you might admire or feel attached to or connected to in some way? Perhaps a character whose experience comes back to you, character from a Shakespeare play perhaps, whose experience comes back to you and resonates with you in some way. What about a signed document? What is our relation to that? Because it's not just to ink and paper, not just to that object, as it were. To say object doesn't capture that, does it? The significance of the paper, your degree certificate, a marriage document. And what about words spoken? Are they also objects that come into play in this consideration of our interaction with others and our relation to things? What about the words in our thought? What is their status? Well, they obviously have some particular characteristics, certain physical regularities. Otherwise, words would not be recognized, would not function as they do in our interactions with other people, which of course precedes our thinking in our language in all its richness, which goes on kind of continuously in our heads all the time. So while it's clear how products' reliability might be assured, the nature of human trust is not so clearly understood or so tidily understood as Sweeney would make out. She's got, on the one hand, she's got people, on the other hand, she's got products. That's far too stark. To think of people here, objects there, that's too stark. It doesn't get the way we are in the world. So a relatively clear dichotomy of the inner and the outer seems to be assumed. And what I'm saying here is to indicate that that clear dichotomy is not as straightforward as it seems. So I'm just thinking I might pass this slide over because it takes us through a brief reference to the imitation game and Turing's development of the notion of the imitation game. Let me come back to it if we want to later on, just to save a little bit of time. And I'm going to go straight into Wittgenstein then. And some of his late writings, these were gathered after he died from copious notes that he made on such matters. And he thought a lot about the nature of psychology and the philosophy of psychology. So let's consider these quotations from him. Can one imagine a people who don't know pretense and to whom one cannot explain it? Can one imagine people who cannot lie? What else would these people lack? We should probably also imagine that they cannot make anything up and do not understand things that are made up. So you see the idea there that's emerging is that there's an integral relation between being truthful and the possibility of telling a lie. He says somewhere else that, can a dog tell a lie? So the two things, telling a lie and being truthful, are part and parcel of the same human capacity, the same element of language and thought within which we live. And you can't simply take one away and maintain the other. And obviously, being truthful is closely connected with telling lies, with not telling lies, and that's closely connected also with being trustworthy. So the notion of trust and what that can mean is very much to the point here. He says, whoever couldn't pretend also couldn't play a role. Because someone who couldn't pretend would just be driven on by their instinctive behavior, their mechanical behavior, as it were, as opposed to that living in that ambivalence of genuineness and falseness, or simulation and genuineness. Isn't the difficulty this? The pretense resides in the intention. For we could, after all, imitate the behavior of pain exactly without pretending. You could all imitate toothache now by lifting your hand and holding your face rather firmly with your hand. But you wouldn't be having toothache. If you wanted to pretend, then you would do that in order to give someone the impression that you genuinely had it. So it'd be the same action, but your intention would be different. So simply going on the actions can never be enough. It needs this broader context within which some things might be described. And he says, I think unforeseeability must be an essential property of the mental, just like the endless multiplicity of expression. So unforeseeability must be an essential property. It's not just a matter of gathering data and then making projections on the basis of very large samples of data. There's something else going on here that the machine doesn't get to. And he goes on to ask what might speak in favor or against a dog's having a mental life. And the German word Seelenleben Zelen is also soul in English, so it's a very rich concept of the mental that he's talking about here. We tend to separate the word mental from the idea of the soul in ways that are very unsteady and unclear, and we're often very unclear about the use of the word soul unless we're strongly religious. But in German, that difference is not so apparent because of the use of the word that I've just referred to. And he says those who say that a dog has no soul support their case by what it can and cannot do. For if someone says that a dog cannot hope, from what does he deduce that? And whoever says that a dog has a soul can only support that with the behavior he observes in the dog. Just look at the face and the movements of the dog, and you'll see that it has a soul. But what is it about the face? Is it only the similarity with the play of the features of the human face? Is it, at least amongst other things, the lack of stiffness? And that lack of stiffness, I think, ties up with the word unforeseeability at the top of the screen, as though the language we tend to succumb to, the conception of language, the kind of thing that computers do, is characterized by a stiffness, the stiffness of the algorithm where ambiguity is not possible. And an algorithm is characterized by the fact that none of the steps in its procedure is ambiguous. Algorithms are very valuable in so much of our lives, but they're not human language. The important fine shades of behavior are not predictable, he says. Again, this ties up with their unforeseeability. The important ones are not predictable. Right, another slide then on the inner and outer, which is a theme that he took up in some of these writings. One could also put it this way: how would a human body have to act so that one would not be inclined to speak of inner and outer human states? Again and again, I think, like a machine. So it's not that he wants to deny the inner and outer, but he thinks it's wrongly constructed and that it's a more variable distinction than we tend to think. Sometimes people construct it in a kind of metaphysical way so that there's a clear-cut division between the two, but it's much more varied what needs to be understood. And the contrast is with the machine. But it is not true that uncertainty in recognizing his irritation, for instance, is simply uncertainty about his future behavior. Rather, in the concept, there's an uncertainty of criteria. So sometimes he's transparent, as it were, and sometimes he isn't. And it's misleading to think of the real irritation as a facial expression of an inner face, so to speak, such that the facial expression is defined completely clearly, and that it's only the outer face that makes it uncertain whether the soul really has this expression. This is what he thinks is a false conception of the inner and the outer. About 2 years earlier, he makes the following remark: imagine that people could observe the functioning of the nervous system in others. In that case, they would have a sure way of distinguishing genuine and simulated feeling. Or might they, after all, doubt in turn whether someone feels anything when these signs are present? What they see there could at any rate readily be imagined to determine their reaction without their having any qualms about it. And now this can be translated to outward behavior. There is indeed the case where someone later reveals his innermost heart to me by a confession. But that this is so cannot offer me any explanation of inner and outer, for I have to give credence, I have to believe the confession. For confession is, of course, something exterior. So let me take those thoughts then that destabilize this kind of settled idea of the inner and the outer, and that challenge this sense of seeing the human being as self-contained, as a kind of Cartesian subject faced with an outer world and cooperating in contingent relationships for matters of mutual interest. Let me move away from that and think about this more blurry account that Wittgenstein is talking about and that Donna Haraway was intimating in some respects, how this might be significant for teaching and learning. At some level, it seems to me there is something confessional about teaching, and it's not really apparent when you're teaching someone to use spreadsheets, but it probably is over a vast range of the things that we think of as more important. The teacher must show why what is being taught matters and why it matters to her. At some level, muted perhaps, she is giving testimony. She's saying what she believes. She believes this is significant. Please listen to me. It matters to you. It matters to me, and I want to show why it will matter to you. When she teaches, she will tell the children that P is a proposition. She'll tell them the date of the Second World War or whatever it might be the children are learning. They will come to learn that thing. They'll come to believe that P. But they will also believe her. And the significance of the fact that when you talk to someone, you're not just getting information from them, but you're getting information or ideas or thoughts from them is something that's been increasingly recognized in recent decades in the philosophy of language, partly with Wittgenstein and certain other thinkers I could mention behind this. So it's a relation with a person. To talk to someone is to relate to a person. And teaching centrally involves this relation to a person, not just believing the product's reliability, but believing them. If we substitute an AI teacher for her, they will also come to believe that P. They'll come to the same item of knowledge, the same bit of information. We could also say that they believe it, that is, they believe Mathia or Watson, whatever the name might be. Those are the names of AI teachers on the market. Just as we believe countless electronic sources as authoritative. You use Google all the time, and mostly you believe what you find there. But it seems obvious that the AI teacher is as trustworthy as a source of information as the sources on which it draws. So that when you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Encyclopedia Britannica or various other sources, you're not just believing a machine. You know that there are human beings behind that machine who are in effect your teachers in this relationship. Okay, so this is the way so much of the information we absorb and we accept has its credibility. It's not product reliability so much the fact that there are human beings behind it. The idea that that could be effaced, or where that is effaced, potentially threatens a grave problem for the way education is understood and conducted. So it's difficult to see this thing that's being taught as mattering to the AI teacher, that is, to the social robot that's teaching you. What could mattering mean here? But with the human teacher, mattering is everything. And this comes close to what it means to be a human being, that you are in this relation to this other person. This other person's got something to tell you. They think it matters somehow. They want to lead you into understanding things as they do. And they think that matters. They're in the center of the triangle in doing this. And it's a relation that involves them as human beings and you as a learner in relation to a human being. If you take that away, so much is unsteadied. And the reference to Rush Reese there is to Wittgenstein's, partly his student, you might say, but also his friend and the person who became his literary executive when Wittgenstein died. And Rush Reese gives the example of a child learning mathematics. And he says that when the child learns the multiplication tables or how to work with quadratic equations or whatever it might be, the child eventually knows how to go on in the appropriate way. That's the way Wittgenstein tends to put it. The child learns how to go on and can encounter new equations, new problems, and deal with them for themselves. But Wittgenstein, Rush Reese thinks, actually sells his own position short. He doesn't express it fully enough. He doesn't probe what is being learned there sufficiently. Reese says that when the child comes to learn this mathematics, the child feels a sense of satisfaction that they've understood something. But what they've understood is not just a skill and the development of a skill or gathered a bit of information about the world. They've understood something about how they can say something in the world, how they can come into this world with other human beings in which we share a conversation about the world and about how things are. So the child is coming into the world. Coming into language is finding we can say things about the world, not just that we can get our wants or we can pursue our wants or satisfy our needs. And that coming into saying things about the world is coming into understanding what the world is. I think this is the last slide. So how testimony is enacted, how is trust realized? So what I'm trying to say is not about the charismatic teacher, nor is it about teachers telling their own story. It's nothing like that at all. And the kind of thing I'm talking about, this way in which the teacher is testifying, takes multiple forms. It's not about teachers saying exactly what they think even. Often the teacher can be very indirect in their approach to the child and not show everything they think. But somehow or other, it's significant that it comes through to the child that what the teacher is talking about matters in some way. I've just put this line there from Emerson. This is not the Emerson computer AI system that's just been developed. This is Emerson, the 19th century American transcendentalist. And he has this sentence, which I think is very rich. He says, "The art of life hath a pudency and will not be exposed." Now, pudency is a word that doesn't really exist in English. It does in French as pudeur, and it means something like restraint or holding back, a sort of modesty. And its opposite is impudence, which means cheekiness or being too forthright, too direct. And that does exist in English. What he means then is that to think well, to understand well, to talk well, often depends upon not trying to spill everything out at once, not trying to describe everything in exact direct terms, but sometimes on a more indirect acknowledgement of things, a more indirect creation of a space into which thought can emerge. Try and name things directly, too directly, and often it goes wrong. So just think for a moment about what teachers do, the teachers you've had, and the various ways they behave. Think of the variety of ways that teachers might talk to students, from the kindergarten to the university seminar or tutorial, where the teacher might tease, cajole, humour, scold, joke, provoke, and play varying roles, and where indeed the students might do some of that in response to the teacher, the teasing, the joking, the provoking. Through this, the teacher testifies to the fact that what they are passing on somehow or other matters. These are circumstances that extend far beyond believing that P, a relation to propositions that may or may not be true. They extend far beyond believing that P because the teacher says so. They are the diverse, unpredictable fabric of conversation and relationship in which trust grows. Okay, thank you very much.